There is no denying that ESG investing has been growing in popularity over the past few years. However, the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic has accelerated this pre-existing trend towards sustainable investing. As public opinion becomes more sensitive and social and environmental issues are more receptive to scrutiny and corporate practices, companies, investors, and other market participants are becoming more aware of the importance of ESG management. My name is Haveen and I'm one of the editors here at the Legal 500. In today's session, our expert panelist speakers will share their experiences and practical insights into ESG and sustainable finance. Before I introduce our panelists for today, I would like to introduce our moderator, Ian Conlon, partner at Maples Group. Ian leads the investment management team in Dublin. He has extensive experience in the establishment, operation and regulation of both UCITS and AIFMD funds, with a particular focus on alternatives, including hedge funds, investment limited partnership vehicles, private equity and private debt, credit funds, loan origination, and real asset structures. Ian is also recognized as a leading lawyer in the ESG and sustainable investment space. He regularly advises asset managers and financial market participants. Welcome, Ian. It's great to have you here today. Now, I would like to warmly welcome our expert panel, who, as industry leaders, will be sharing their thoughts and experiences. In no particular order, joining us today is Timo Spinster, Head of Legal Germany, Austria and Switzerland at Banco Santander. Timo is an internationally acclaimed head of legal and currently runs the legal, corporate and investment banking division for Germany, Austria, Switzerland and Scandinavia. Before joining Santander, Timo has worked at 3 major banks and at 3 leading international law firms. During the years, Timo has received many accolades, including appearing on our very own GC Power List Germany several times. He also sits on the GC Power List Germany Advisory Board. Despite having such a full schedule, Timo also finds time to be a board member and professor at the Institute of Law and Finance at Goethe University in Frankfurt. He also has been published by notable publications such as the Harvard Business Law Review. Timo, I know you're currently on vacation at the moment, so thank you for taking the time to join us today.
My pleasure, thank you.
Next on the panel is Peter Meany, Global Head of ESG Integration and Research at Manulife. In this role, Peter leads Manulife Investment Management's team of dedicated ESG research and integration analysis to advance their firm's ESG agenda. The team works with portfolio management teams on progressing ESG integration processes and conducting ESG engagement with investee companies. He also works with Manulife Investment Management's sales and product teams on ESG strategy and marketing. Peter also represents the company in various industry groups and collaborative initiatives. In addition to all this, Peter also serves as the company's Chief Operating Officer. Welcome, Peter. It's nice to have you here today.
Thank you very much.
Also with us is Therese Nicholson, Global Head of Sustainability at 91. Therese is responsible for overseeing the overall sustainability approach across the business. She works closely with the board, executive leadership, as well as the investment and risks teams to ensure the stewardship, integration, and active ownership are in place and aligned with 91's business purpose and strategic priorities. Therese joined 91 in 2011, initially as the head of ESG research, and then as global head as ESG, leading the first phase of ESG focus across the business. She has a wealth of experience from various sustainability areas in the investment industry. Welcome to the panel, Therese.
Thank you. Hello, it's nice to be here.
Last but not least, we have Anthony Kenny, Assistant General Counsel at GSK. For those who don't know, GSK is a global healthcare company, and Anthony has been leading legal operations for over 7 years. During this time, Anthony has acted as both GC and business advisor and has provided legal, risk management, compliance advice. He has held senior positions within the legal and risk management team of professional service firms, industry, and private practice. Anthony's specialties include M&A, corporate law, corporate governance, compliance, regulation, tax, treasury, commercial contracts, privacy, and project leadership. Now, that's just to mention a few. Welcome, Anthony. It's great to have you here.
Great to be here. Hello.
So now that the formal introductions are out of the way, we would like to thank our sponsors for today, Maples Group, for supporting this webinar. Before I hand over the reins to Ian, who will get the session started, we just wanted to let all our viewers know that if you do have any questions throughout the session, feel free to type them in the Q&A chat boxes, which you should find somewhere on your screen. With that being said, I will now hand over to our moderator. Thank you, Ian.
Thank you, Harveen, for that very kind introduction. And I'd also like to welcome our panelists to today's webinar, which I have no doubt will be a very informative session. So without further ado, Peter, turning to you first, if I may. ESG integration means different things to different organizations. In your role as head of ESG integration at Manulife, what does ESG integration mean to you, and what has been your approach to it? And then more generally speaking, how progress do you believe companies are at ESG integration? Are they ahead of lawmakers in terms of embracing ESG?
Great question. Thank you, Ian. So for us, I guess ESG integration means thinking about ESG at all stages of the investment process, all the way from the research and the due diligence on the companies that we invest in, through to portfolio construction, implementation, and risk management. And really, what we look for in our investment teams is to integrate ESG factors, to think carefully about them and the impact they may have on both the risk and the return of the investments we're making, all the way through that investment process. And then alongside that, we see ESG integration fits perfectly with stewardship and with collaboration in the industry. So we see there's really these three pillars to being successful and to really making an actual impact in terms of the outcome. So in other words, improving the outcome for the planet as well as for our portfolios. So you integrate ESG into your portfolio construction, think about it in terms of the risk profile and the reward profile. You then have stewardship activity, so you're engaging with companies, encouraging them to change. That may be things like encouraging them to report in line with TCFD, or encouraging them to report new statistics or make changes to their approach. And then there's collaborative ventures, and really we think collaborative ventures are incredibly important too, because you can't change the world by yourself. Investors' voice is much better amplified by working collectively. And so we were founder members of things like Climate Action 100+, which is obviously a great industry initiative which enables investors to come together and work together and articulate their views to companies and encourage them to change. So really those three pillars, the ESG integration, the stewardship and collaboration, we think are really important and are what people are looking for. And then obviously on top of that, some clients are also keen to not only have an impact through the stewardship programs, but also have an impact in terms of their investments and perhaps consider the sustainability characteristics of investments that they might make alongside the financial outcome. So in that we would regard that as sustainable investing, which is a step beyond ESG integration, where a client is really after that sustainability objective and wants to balance that against the financial objective. So in terms of the second part of your question about how far companies have progressed, that's obviously an incredibly difficult question. There's lots of metrics for how companies have progressed, but if we kind of bring it to sort of one part of the equation, there's obviously areas of ESG that have progressed a lot more than others. So climate change is the obvious one, right? Everyone is fully aware of climate change, understands climate change. There's a framework for disclosing on climate change, TCFD, which is a good framework for disclosing strategy. And obviously there's a lot of data coming out in climate change, and companies are increasingly disclosing their carbon emissions in a variety of ways and in a variety of detail. So I think if you look now, I think around 60 of the world's top 100 companies are disclosing in line with TCFD. So we've seen that kind of steady progress of companies disclosing more and more. In terms of whether it's ahead of lawmakers, I think that's difficult to say. That there's obviously aspects of regulation that are advancing faster than disclosure advances. So the aspects of the recent legislation, Europe SFDR, there are disclosures that European companies will make, which companies outside Europe won't make, which will make it difficult for investors to respond to that. But then there are other areas where companies are very much making a lot of progress, particularly on climate change. So I think it's a difficult question to answer, but I'd say that companies are advancing pretty rapidly, and that's a really good thing, I think, and a really good outcome for the efforts of investors generally over the last several years.
Thank you, Peter. And Therese, just picking up on a few points that Peter made, would your experiences be similar in 91 Asset Management? And in your view, has ESG integration now become mainstream? Is it an established component of corporate strategic planning and decision-making processes?
Yeah, Ian, so absolutely. I mean, I would fully echo what Peter has been saying, and there's no doubt that it has become mainstream. That doesn't mean necessarily that it's become completely harmonized across markets. So we are still, I think, battling a bit with the interpretation of ESG integration. To some, it's about just a risk assessment. You are seeking to identify and understand the risk, and then in some way price the risk. That's a terminology that I think we throw around a lot, assuming that we do know how to price it, but to assess it and then shift the risk if possible. But it's not suggesting that it's an industry that is going to allocate away necessarily from certain sectors or certain companies. It's suggesting that today we have a fuller appreciation of the set of risks that a company is facing. And we have this because the invoices from our planet are now starting to come through. We have seen economic growth for a very long time where that has not been, those externalities have not been priced in effectively. And whether we like it or not, we are now coming up towards tipping points that are forcing us to understand and address these issues. So it's a massive movement. It is absolutely mainstream. There is not a due diligence or a client walking through the door that is not asking about it. They will bring their own views and preferences to the space as well. And it is healthy to have different interpretations and approaches to this. But you mentioned the regulatory landscape, but that's something a bit more recent where we're seeing that perhaps it can come to heads a bit with respect to what's expected from a regulatory perspective and what the industry has tried to evolve over time. The final point I would just make, as with all of these things, the headlines and sort of the perceptions are perhaps a little bit ahead of what's actually going on still inside asset managers. Ultimately, we're talking about a massive transformation that needs to happen. This is not about building big ESG teams or armies of people that's going to take these decisions for investment teams. We're actually trying to evolve and transform existing investment teams. And that brings all sorts of challenges, and it's a time-consuming undertaking.
Thank you, Therese. And moving on to the topic of how ESG is influencing corporate culture. Timo, how do you see ESG changing corporate and investment culture? And what advantages do you see for a company that embraces and cultivates a culture of corporate responsibility and sustainability?
Excellent question. Thanks, Ian. Thanks again for the opportunity that I could be here. What I will share with you today are my own views. And in my own views, consumers and investors alike seem to value ethically produced goods and services so much that they may even be prepared to pay more for them. And this actually creates an enormous incentive for investment product providers to actively target this investor subclass by way of introducing ESG-based products. Complying with ESG principles then provides the company with a certain intangible value, which is appreciated by the market, thus providing better equity and debt financing opportunities to the company. Several studies have found a positive relationship between ESG disclosure level and company value, which suggests that improved transparency, accountability, and enhanced stakeholder confidence play a role in boosting corporate value. Market forces generally reward companies with a high level of ESG. Analysis of major European indices on the impact of sustainability indicators on performance show a significant positive correlation. And similarly, recent findings show that Standard & Poor's 500 companies ranking in the top quintile for ESG factors outperformed those in the bottom quintile by more than 25 percentage points between the beginning of 2014 and the end of June 2018. So the data is very clear in this respect. Most companies in most sectors can expect significant economic benefits from adopting ESG criteria into their business model. And it's always better to be on the right side of history, of course, and many companies that have had a less than stellar historical track record could perhaps take this opportunity to make up for past wrongs. So culture is not an aspect of the game, it is the entire game, and ESG is a great opportunity for all of us.
Thanks, Timo. And Anthony, picking up on some of those themes, like there'll be many GCs in our audience today listening in. So what do you see as the role of a general counsel in shaping the direction of ESG integration and cultivating a sustainable culture within an organization?
So yes, I think picking up on a major theme from what Timo was saying there is, I think, you look at one of the macro trends is, the importance of reputation in terms of the valuation of a company has really shifted massively. So I think it's gone from like 36%, to 86% or 70% now. So reputation of a business is critical, and this is an issue. When I say issue, it's an umbrella term for a whole range of issues that can go from human rights and labor rights issues in our supply chain right the way through to climate change, and we could probably spend hours talking of each of these. But I think as a topic, my perception is that another macro trend, in addition to the importance of reputation, is the real growth of ESG at board level. It's now seen as, I think, one of the top 3 risks that the executives are focusing on. And as a lawyer sitting internally, whether you be GC or another lawyer in the team, it's a multifaceted kind of view. You need to think of this topic through. On the one hand, you've got your obligations to report out into the market about what you're doing as a business, and as Therese and others have said, that's increasingly becoming more and more rigorous. And then you've got your due diligence of potential targets in terms of when you're buying. What risk is potentially lurking in a target. So lawyers have to think much more than we did in the past around what kind of due diligence questions should we be asking of potential targets. And I think we're lucky as lawyers, GCs particularly, of having that sort of real broad breadth view of a company. As I say, right the way through from supply chain all the way through to the very high-end strategic discussions that are happening at board level. So we're very lucky in that sense. And I think a lot of the topics covered by the banner of ESG, I think play well into the skill sets of lawyers in terms of the issues being covered. I think we also have an important role potentially to play. And I mean, I use this term influencing, but I mean it in a good way, not in a kind of corrupt way. But I think we potentially, on behalf of our businesses, have an opportunity to work with government, work with regulators, work with NGOs, and understand and really get a common understanding of the issues and what we should be measured. What's the important things to measure and report on that are going to really turn the dial on moving forward in the right direction. And I think lawyers have an important role to play there. I've seen that happen on a range of different topics over the years, that in many ways, often regulators and government are wanting that. They want to have that industry perspective. And I think lawyers have because it's obviously regulatory in nature and legal in nature, that we have a role to play in helping everyone understand and work through that. And then just also there's, as well as the opportunities, and there are lots, and Timo, you touched on many of them, we also have to remember that there are risks with this as well. It's all well and good to try and strive for enhancing your reputation with shareholders, investors, potential employees of the future, and your existing employee base, but that could be seriously undermined if you're greenwashing, and that will, I think, increasingly be highlighted as we move forward. That there'll be, those will be weeded out. Those who are doing that, those who have been approaching this in a cynical way, will be identified. But also there's litigation. I think quite rightly so. We're benefiting from the opportunity of enhanced reputation, as Timo said. But I think the litigation bar is jumping on that and saying, well, if you're a parent company in the UK or the US and you're going out getting the benefit of increased value to your company, if you cause environmental damage in Africa, don't hide behind this, the parent subsidiary barrier. we're potentially going to be coming after you. So there is a balance that companies have to find between doing the right thing and wanting to talk about what they're doing in terms of the right thing, and having policies and global policies and effective policies, but also what that could mean from a litigation risk as well. So I think all of that plays into lawyers, I think, having an important role in this space.
Fascinating. Thank you, Anthony. So this is probably not the question for this panel, but for those non-adopters out there, for those who still see ESG as a compliance burden, as an unnecessary business expense, Timo touched on this earlier on, but how would you encourage them to see sort of ESG integration as a tool for long-term value creation?
You know, these days, I think it pays to be good, because following ESG principles in and of itself creates value, as many studies find. For example, McKinsey has recognized that ESG compliance boosts employee motivation, helps in attracting talent through greater social credibility, enhances investment returns by better allocating capital for the long term, helps also in avoiding investments that may not pay off because of longer term environmental issues, helps in cost reductions by decreasing energy consumptions, and also helps in attracting more community and government funding. So if nothing else, non-adopters should believe in the bottom line.
Ian, may I dive in? I mean, I heard a phrase, which I think is an interesting twist on the Wall Street, you know, greed is good as moving to green is good. But I think the answer really is, I don't think you have a choice. I think, you know, especially when you look at climate change, it's not, we're running out of time. There's no optionality here. So I think we all, as a global community and as business and those who support business, we almost have a duty now, I think, to do the right things. I think we're still in this golden period, I think, where there is an opportunity to be seen to be ahead of the game, and getting bonus points for that. But I think that's rapidly going to become an expectation that that's business as usual because of the need to do this.
If I could just follow on to that, I completely agree with that. And I think as sort of investors, we can help amplify that message to companies. So, you know, I'm fortunate to work with lots of seasoned portfolio managers who've spent years sort of working with company management teams and understanding how they think and how they look at issues. And so what I think we're able to do as investors is sort of go in to meet companies in those kind of meetings that we regularly have with our key investments, and talk with them about how we see these issues and why we see them as important. And I think Timo just highlighted a second ago the impact on return. I'd also say the impact on risk. So you know, if a company is say creating a culture that's say not a culture of compliance, not a culture of disclosure, not a culture of openness within the company, then obviously that can lead to, you know, declining ethical standards. It can lead to, you know, toleration of things like modern slavery, all those things which are of big concern to us from an ESG perspective. And if we can relate that to companies, to the management teams, in terms of this is how the market perceives this is how the valuation evolves, and this is how the risk is heightened. I think that really helps companies to see, you know, why it's important for them, because when these ESG risks appear, they often appear as tail risks, right? They emerge, something bad happens, and suddenly there's a big shock to the share price or the bond price or whatever, and there's effectively a permanent diminution in value of that asset or that company. And so I think if as we go around explaining that to companies and explaining why we see it's important, I think that's kind of what gets management teams' attentions and then gets action. So I think that the investment management industry has that's why we have a real role to play here, in my view.
Maybe, Ian, if I'm allowed to jump in as well and just give a slightly different perspective, perhaps, or not different, but I think what is important for our industry to focus on is to ensure that we do sustainability with substance, if I can call it that. There is an awful lot of box ticking going on in our industry. I mean, that is a fact, and it is a reality. There is, I think, a conflicting view between wanting to step away and not finance the things that we consider to be dirty or unethical, whatever it is. But the reality is the only way you get out of the problems we've created is also to finance the way out of it. So we do need to think carefully about how we ensure we don't leave certain parts of the world behind, because it doesn't look the same as what we're used to in Europe, perhaps, whether it's corporate governance or something else. We do a lot of infrastructure investment in the deepest, darkest parts of Africa, for example, and it's not issue free by no means, but the development that needs to happen to improve lives and create economic growth is real. So I think there are ways that we can improve what our industry does to try and be a little bit more honest about what the capital needs to do and the challenges around it. So, I mean, good ESG does not equal sort of better returns all the time. That's not a given. There are aspects of it that definitely contributes to financial aspects to a business that is favorable. And companies do need to future-proof, given that we are going into a world that's going to look substantially different from 2 decades ago. There's no doubt about that. And certain companies and certain industries will become obsolete unless they get on board with that transition. So yeah, I think that's just maybe a different way to think about it too.
Thanks, Therese. Just to remind everybody, you do have the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. If you want to leave questions for the panelists, we will ask those at the end. But shifting gears a little onto climate change and the impact of COVID-19. Climate change is arguably one of the greatest systematic risks we face today. If there's no action on climate change, there'll be disastrous consequences. So with that in mind, what do the panel believe should financial organizations and long-term investors, asset managers be doing to influence the COVID-19 economic recovery plans to support the transition to net zero emissions by 2050? Peter, would you like to lead off on that?
Sure, yeah. Well, I think investors essentially need to encourage governments to make sure that those plans are directed towards sustainable investments as far as possible. And so, directed towards areas of the economy that will be sustainable and will power that transition. Obviously, in the early stages of sort of emerging from this recovery, it's perhaps been more difficult for governments to kind of go through that, because their obviously initial focus is simply on recovery at all costs. But I think that given the level of commitment we have now from governments, it's very difficult not to believe that they won't really make that step and really be pushing for the the extra investments that they will make as a sort of stimulus measure to really focus on those areas. I think the comments that we see coming out of governments in Cornwall recently and so on really suggest that there is that appetite to do that. There are some easy wins that that governments can make now in certain sectors where it's perhaps easier to decarbonize. There's going to be some more challenging sections later where it's going to cost people quite a lot of money to decarbonize certain things. But I think now really though there is a very clear opportunity for governments to seize the opportunity of the clear need to create that sort of Keynesian style stimulus now, to direct that stimulus only in those areas where it's genuinely sustainable, and particularly from the perspective of climate change, where it's clearly low carbon investments. I would also add though to your comment at the beginning about climate change, I think there are other kind of clear existential risks that we have. I think if you look across the environmental spectrum, there's biodiversity loss, which I think is an extremely important concern as well. And as we see TNFD starting only a couple of weeks ago, the Task Force on Nature-related Financial Disclosure, I think we're going to see an increasing interest in biodiversity loss, the damage to nature that we're causing as well, and just making sure that people are and companies are reporting and disclosing on that, and I think that will step up in focus in exactly the same way that climate has stepped up in focus over the last few years.
Emma, would you like to come in on that?
The European Union has already taken massive strides in terms of regulatory and economic policies to achieve the net zero goal. So the next generation EU recovery plan aims to address the damage caused by the pandemic and invest in a green, digital, social, and more resilient EU. And is together with the EU's long-term budget, the largest stimulus package that's ever financed in Europe. A total of 1.8 trillion euros are set to help rebuild a post-COVID-19 Europe with ESG principles in mind. And that being said, I believe that more so than actually trying to influence overarching COVID-19 recovery plans, financial organizations should rather focus on making sure their business models sufficiently support goals of sustainability overall. In terms of banks, banking institutions can implement sustainable banking both in their internal daily operations, in terms of how they manage their physical branches or locations, human capital, costs, opportunities, and risk exposures, and also their activities relating to external interactions with their clients and the types of products they fund. By incorporating sustainability principles into corporate strategy funding decisions, banks can be influential in supporting and promoting environmentally and/or socially responsible projects and enterprises. Innovative products and services that target certain populations, for example, women, or that encourage purchase of green products, for example, green credit cards, go a long way to promoting sustainable practices. And given the strategic importance in the value chains of critical sectors such as agriculture, energy, and trade, the role of banks in the sustainable development of any economy cannot be underestimated. But despite that, all financial actors ought to be mindful of the long-term repercussions of each ESG-oriented decision. Declining, for example, to renew loans on existing coal mines, for example, may improve a bank's carbon disclosures, but it could lead also to significant social implications when the mines close and unemployment grows, which in turn would have a massive impact on that market's retail lending and potential impairments. So I think that goes in the direction what as Therese mentioned before, that we always have to have a look at both sides of the story.
Thanks, Timo. Anthony, just moving on to you, and the UN Climate Change Conference COP26 will take place later this year. How confident are you that COP26 can deliver on its goals of enhancing international collaboration on climate change, as well as mobilizing international capital to meet the 2050 targets?
I think I'd link back to where the direction Peter was going, and I think, you know, there's I'm more confident than I've ever been. I think that the move, the focus, and again, referring back to what you said, Timo, the level of investment, there's definitely seems to be at the European level a desire to move forward in the right way. I think there's now more of an understanding of the urgency, particularly around climate change, to deal with these challenges. So I'm confident. I'm more confident than I've ever been. But I'm realistic as well. There are huge geopolitical issues here around, developed versus undeveloped world, and and how that's going to ultimately get resolved. Because I think to really move the dial on the issue of climate change, and I also commend Peter for referring to biodiversity as well, which we shouldn't, being nature positive. These are big issues that different people around the world are at different stages of getting. I think we need to be joined up as a global population in terms of these big issues. I think we'll make big progress at COP26. Hopefully the biggest step forward we've made in recent times and in all these different conferences. But I think there's we shouldn't underestimate the level of work that will need to be done, I think, because of the geopolitical complications.
And just picking up on that sort of joined up point and collaboration point, and I think Therese and both Timo, you mentioned it a moment ago, like what do you feel that developed nations could be doing to assist emerging and developing countries who are really grappling with the transition from high carbon activities and whose economies are disproportionately impacted by the 2050 targets? Therese, you want to come back in on that?
Yeah, thank you. I mean, Ian, if I had the perfect answer to this, I would, maybe be doing something different, because, this continues to be the dominating issue at the COP meetings for the last couple of years. And I think it's both about what we should be doing, which is, of course, to put up the right kind of financing for these markets. We have to recognize that this is not a race to zero between countries. This is a race against time. where no country is going to win this race. That's not how it's going to work. So the transition pathways will have to be different for different countries, which is also relevant to the whole conversation about COVID, right? Because certain countries don't even have a proper transition plan worked out for their country, which they can then plug into and build fiscal policies around and plans, etc. You know, our organization is originated in South Africa, and that is a country, for example, that is definitely in need of not just capital, but also the expertise for how to draw up those plans. So I think technical transfer support, and then financial investment. I would say that there are certain things that we should not be doing, which is to encourage initiatives that are encouraging Western investors to decarbonize portfolios, for example, in a way that does not have a real economy impact. So what I mean by that, for example, is the net zero movement, which is focusing on committing to decarbonization in portfolios based on scope 1 and 2 emissions. And a way to do that on an annual basis would be to reallocate to other types of sectors. So if you doubled your exposure to US tech, for example, in your portfolio, you achieve 7% emissions reduction on a portfolio basis, but you have done nothing, right, to actually decarbonize the real economy. So there needs to be, I think, very careful consideration from developed nations on the red lines that they're putting out in terms of we will not finance anything that has fossil fuels in it, which is sort of the messaging that we're getting from some of the development institutions around Europe and their appetite in true emerging markets for doing that. Not recognizing that we're going to need a fossil fuel-based economy for a while longer, and some markets are going to have to, you know, sort of get a little bit worse before they can turn this around. Instead, what we should be doing is allocating and provide attractive cost of capital to those countries and to those companies that are doing the most. That's what we should do. We still need to have red lines, of course, in the sense that we should not be keeping capital with organizations that are just slowly getting towards the end of the cliff. But change needs to be financed. And that's, I think, what should be encouraged by COP and by countries that have a more luxurious position with their own transition plans.
If I could just add to that, I completely agree with everything Therese said just there, and I think it is kind of one of the biggest challenges, I guess, for our industry, is that it's easy to measure some things. So low carbon, for example, in the example that Therese just gave. So constructing a low carbon portfolio by manipulating sectors or whatever, obviously very straightforward. You know, it's a simple kind of numerical optimization exercise. And so it's easy to write a regulation that says a portfolio should be low carbon or it should have a high ESG score or whatever. But as Therese said, it's really important that what you're trying to achieve is the outcome of a low carbon economy, not a low carbon portfolio for your investors necessarily today. So but what's more difficult to measure, and I imagine is more tricky from a legal perspective as well, is the impact that the portfolio is having. So, you know, the investment manager, many investment managers, including ours, you know, our aim is to be good stewards of capital, to work with companies and encourage them to decarbonize. And so, you know, I would love to be invested in companies that are making a difference. You know, there are some really big challenges that we have to surmount to decarbonize the world economy. We don't have a path for some things. Cement would be a perfect example, right? We're clearly going to carry on building things on this planet, so we need a pathway to sort of green cement, and that is something that people should be willing to invest in. It's a good thing. It will be a good outcome for society, but it is a high carbon investment currently. So it's kind of working out how we frame that and how we measure that effectively, so that people can see that it's not just about investing in a fund that superficially has attributes like low carbon, but in fact is actively encouraging a change.
Thanks, Peter. So moving on to what policymakers and regulators are doing to sort of incentivize private capital into the sustainable space. Like, we're now 6 months out from the full implementation of the European Union's SFDR and taxonomy regulations. and there's probably many people in today's audience who are grappling with the implementation of these new laws. So, Therese, if I may just turn to you, like generally speaking, do you agree with the drivers behind these regulations? And what do you see as the challenges being faced by firms by SFDR and taxonomy?
Yeah, so absolutely. I think it's hard to deny that the regulatory push and involvement was probably both inevitable and probably also needed. What it's trying to achieve is, of course, more true allocation to sustainable investment, getting rid of some of the greenwashing, which has undoubtedly been in the market and been growing for many, many years, and just trying to create a harmonization around what we call a green investment, etc. So they're all very worthy initiatives. I believe that it's a set of regulations that has been both drawn and implemented and rolled out quicker than any other regulation in the EU, which tells us something about the urgency to it. Like with all of these things, and this is definitely my first full dip into the regulatory world in my industry in this sense. Most of what we've built over the years has been very much voluntary driven. The UK in particular has a strong comply or explain approach to things, which is quite different from some of our European countries. So we're not really used to operate in this new landscape. So for all the good bits, there are definitely some real challenges to this. And I'll probably put the taxonomy to one side a little bit and focus instead on perhaps the current definition of sustainable investment, which is really quite interesting, and what kind of incentives that would create. We have a definition for that by the regulators, but we must interpret it and put it into practice. The reality is that the interpretation of what is a sustainable investment varies incredibly. And to create a harmonized approach to this in an investment firm, which has always thrived on the ability to have its own analysis and ultimate viewpoints made, is problematic, right? What are those stocks that are truly sustainable? The tests that have been put out for those investments, particularly with regards to good governance and having to pass that. Again, I go back to put my emerging market hats on. 20% of investment into renewable energy is currently in emerging markets. That is where 90% of emissions currently will come from, and where we need to build this infrastructure, where we need to change these systems. The governance systems in emerging markets, we know look different from what either the OECD or any other sort of governance principles put out. And we are concerned that technically with some of these hurdles that have with good intentions been put out there, we're going to struggle to actually classify these as sustainable investments into category 9 or impact funds or sustainable products. And, that can result in all sorts of behaviors, either by outsourcing fully to ESG service providers that are just going to tell you what is a sustainable investment, and you're going to have to start gaming somehow this regulation to ensure that you can put the capital where it's needed. So there are unintended consequences that I'm sure we will start discussing more as sort of theory moves into practice a bit more. But when we go on calls with our peers, when we speak to legal counsel, etc., there is not a uniform sort of message that we have this under control, that we know what we're looking at, how this is going to work. So it's a challenge.
I would most certainly agree with your point about it's been accelerated. I've never seen a piece of such groundbreaking legislation 6 months out from its implementation date remaining in draft form. But I think it's just it was an unfortunate victim of the COVID-19 disruption. But thank you, Therese, for those insights. And keeping on the sort of the regulatory theme, Anthony, the UK have left the European Union now, and they've recently announced that they are going to establish their own, UK taxonomy or green taxonomy as part of their plans for divergence post Brexit. It's like, clearly regulatory disruption or divergence is disruption to businesses. But what do you see, or might be the impacts for businesses if there is substantial divergence between blocks such as the UK and the EU and the US and the EU on ESG matters?
Well, I think it's just whenever we have on any topic such a divergence of regulations, it just creates extra reporting obligations, therefore extra resources, and it's just the intentions are good, but obviously it's diverting capital that could be used to actually get on and solve the issue, having to employ people to kind of report them across multiple different taxonomies. So as corporates, we would always really want, and something as important as this. The other issue as well is obviously they'll be very similar, but there'll be differences. And if you're working across a global environment, how are you comparing sometimes these different taxonomies? So, but I think the biggest issue for me is that if we're going to really move forward with this, we should be hoping and that the government, governments around the world will try and focus in on an agreed global taxonomy that we can be measuring against and reporting against. One that will be easier for corporates, but also I think we have to remember as well as, there are different resources within governments. There are different resources within small companies versus large companies, and we should be ideally creating an environment where everyone can report on the key, really important issues in a way that is sustainable. Because it's all in good. Big companies like GSK can absorb quite a lot of different regulations. We can absorb quite a lot of different multiple different questions. But what about a medium-sized company? What about small companies? We want them to be focused on these issues as well. And this kind of thing, this kind of extra time and effort can be, the difference between your company surviving and not. I mean, not trying to exaggerate it. And again, local, the UK government, the European level, you can have these big taxonomies, but what about the smaller nations? What resources do they have to be monitoring and tracking these issues? So the more we can move through, whether it be through the UN or whatever, choose your platform, to having a global system, a global way of monitoring on issues, that'd be great. And I think having mandatory or having clarity about what you're reporting versus kind of leaving it up to everyone to do their own thing is a good. I think having clarity about what we're supposed to be reporting on is good. But I think I just take the analogy of a contract. With SLAs, as the customer, you're tempted to put in a whole schedule of SLAs. When I see that, my challenge to the business is always, how many of these SLAs that you're asking the supplier to report against and spend money on reporting against are we actually going to use? What are the important ones? Because why would we spend time monitoring and reading them and asking them to divert resources that they could be doing a better job for us on to report on, when of those 20 you can actually probably get 5 are important. And I think that's what we need to move to. What are the really important things we want to measure and report against? And let's get global views on that, and then have corporates report against that.
Thanks, Anthony. So I'm going to move on towards some of the questions that we've got from the audience members. Some have been answered, and thanks for everybody for using the Q&A function and sharing these. But one, if I may just put this to all panelists, is the net zero carbon emissions target of 2050 too far out? We'd like to take that.
I can perhaps start. Well, I mean, that's the point in time, right, where the IPCC have told us that the world, by and large, needs to be net zero to stay within the safe limits. Achieving that any sooner, I think, would be more than a stretch. I think it's a stretch already, I would say, globally for 2050. We should be optimistic, of course, but I think there is quite a few people that think that 2050 is just too soon, right? we need to be somewhere quite far down, at least, that path to accelerate the turnaround for it, because I suspect it's a little bit like the runaway climate change concept, that once something that starts accelerating in a negative direction, we can perhaps benefit from an acceleration, you know, and tipping points on the more positive end, where investment opportunities and some of these policy issues untangle themselves, perhaps. So no, it's not too far out.
Yeah, and I think it's clearly a stretch target in a way. I think the IEA came out with a report and a transition pathway for the energy sector, which, you know, clearly was a surprise in some regards, and that it was a tough message about what needed to happen to achieve 2050 net zero. So I think it kind of gets across the clear message to companies that we need to do something about this. It's not saying, you know, wait till 2050. You know, there's two places for the carbon. It's either in the atmosphere or it's in the ground, and you know, there's a certain amount that we can safely have in the atmosphere. So the more we carry on polluting, you know, the bigger the problem we create. But on the other hand, saying 2050 is sufficiently soon that it's created a very clear goal, which is a stretch goal, which people therefore understand they need to address. And companies that have come out with net zero goals ahead of that are actually, you know, being recognised as leaders. So it's not saying that 2050 is you know, the only goal. If your company can decarbonise sooner, then you should. And that's clearly what some companies have done and have been properly recognised for that, where it's been a genuine achievement.
Great, thanks, Peter. There's a question here for Anthony.
I'm just reading it now. The one about lawyers for net zero.
Yeah. So,
do you want me to answer it?
Yeah, please go ahead.
So yeah. So the initiative, I think that the premise is simple, that as in-house counsel, we have an opportunity to influence business and be part of helping business understand the challenges of net zero. And, you know, as we've learned today, different organizations are at different parts on their journey. There, some organizations have ESG teams and for people dedicated full time, others do not. And many of the in-house counsel, as part of that, coming together as this group, are at the very kind of early stages. So part of this group is about forming a like-minded community of people to kind of skill up, get up to speed, and understand from each other what we can and can't do in this space. So that's the driver behind it. And, you know, why? Good question. Why should we as a legal counsel drive this type of idea? I'd ask the question, why not? As I said earlier, we've got a good set of skills. We are in a position where we can and do interact with governmental institutions and share our ideas, and they want our input. I think we as part of our roles, whether your role is purely legal versus legal on compliance, have to advise the business on key business risks, and I think this is a key business risk, like any other. So yeah, that's my answer for the why. And another kind of answer is, certainly what I've seen with lawyers for net zero so far is that a lot of lawyers are passionate about this topic and just want to get involved in even in the smallest way within their business. So this is the platform to enable them to do that.
Mm-hmm. Just to add on that, you know, at the bottom of corporate sustainability, I believe there is integrity, you know, integrity being compliance with formal rules, legal and commercial ethics, but also values. And, you know, the lawyers need to be more than the technical legal experts. We also need to be wise counselors and accountable leaders. And we also, you know, need to act in a way as lawyer statespersons. That has, you know, been highlighted by as old a lawyer as Louis Brandeis. But I believe that fits the current discussion very well, because as a lawyer statesperson, you don't need to stop at what is the legal implication of your assessment, but you clearly want to do the right thing, and you also advise the business on what is to do the right thing with a view to the future. And therefore, I think that, you know, that ESG and sustainability implementation are chances for the in-house legal function to step up and you know, to fully accommodate their partner guardian function to the business.
Thanks, Timo. Another question from the audience. So a lot of firms talk well about ESG. It's easy to do that with glossy presentations and nice websites. But how does one distinguish firms between the sound good and the do good? Anyone would like to take that?
I'll give one word answer to that one. Metrics. I think it's about, you know, we can all talk about a good game or and have, as you say, the glossy magazines, but you know, as someone on the receiving end of those, we just have to ask the questions. Well, show me, what is your carbon footprint last year? What is it this year? What are you doing to reduce your plastic consumption? What about your water management? You know, and biodiversity. There's a whole range of questions you can ask. What capital are you investing in the road to net zero? So there's lots of questions we should be asking, and a genuine, because I think this is where there's an opportunity and a risk here. The opportunity is to do this and to do it with, you know, well, and to do it with, you know, because you want to do it. It's the right thing to do, and be authentic about it versus doing it, you know, just because you think it's the right. It's going to increase your share price.
I would agree with Anthony. I think having a commitment to accountability for it through KPIs, proper KPIs, not fluffy sort of we commit to, aspire to, try and do something, right? But quite specific KPIs to deliver on the strategic targets that the business has set out for executives of the business. I think that's a good sign, definitely. I think also on that same accountability point, those companies that are starting to put, for example, say on climate resolutions onto their agenda, which could be a whole other legal discussion, because I know that's not something that's uniformly supported, and there's a whole legal discussion around the ramification of that. And then finally, from an investment perspective, it should not be a separate ESG team that talks to clients about how this is done. The portfolio managers needs to have an incredibly good grasp of not just the high level story, but practically how they're thinking about this and how they are trying to create value for clients. That's another good sign if they're able to do that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's completely obvious when you meet a firm and you're talking to their management team whether they're really into ESG or whether there's a lot of greenwashing on their website. And you know, to complement the things that Therese and Anthony said as well, you know, there's lots of people monitoring this as well. There's obviously commercial providers that are looking and rating companies on ESG, and there's obviously many NGOs and so on that are making comments. So you obviously have to have metrics, KPIs, and be convincing. And a nice website that actually doesn't say anything will probably do you more harm than good, because you'll draw attention to yourself and people will ask you more moral questions and identify that what you're doing is not real.
Absolutely. You know, I agree with everything my fellow panelists have said. We need to be talking a lot less fluff and more data, you know, and that's which is also very important to regain the public trust from some companies, because, you know, the last credit crisis led to a huge moral hazard problem. And, you know, we could embrace this new development as a chance to win something back from that lost trust. And I think that personally, meeting ESG criteria should also be implemented strongly into executive compensation. You know, not only following the old model of reaching the numbers, but also in terms of doing it the right way and you know, fulfilling ESG goals along the way. Because when it targets the pay, or their own pay, this issue gets to be taken very seriously, I find.
Okay, we're coming up on the hour, but there's probably one other question I'd like to ask. It's like, what has been the effect of the pandemic on sustainable investment? And do you think it's accelerated the adoption of a changing culture? Timo, would you like to take that?
You know, in the pandemic, we have seen that in many corporations, the digitalization efforts have been less than adequate. You know, unfortunately, we could step up quickly in many areas, but in many others, we are still lagging behind. So we should definitely use that as a chance to make good on this field and to you know, to take a risk and turn that into an opportunity. And I think you know, everybody can behave nicely when the seas are calm, but when the crisis hits and when the seas get rough, that's when you really can challenge the value of a team. So you know, rather than now panicking because of the uncertain situation, you know, we need strong stewards who can help us to really embrace this as an opportunity, you know, to remain stronger together in the end of this process.
I think it also that, you know, COVID obviously struck very suddenly, very quickly, and we saw that it's had a massive global economic impact. So you know that this kind of the zoonotic disease, it really just emphasizes the importance of tackling these kind of systemic issues, and that you know, people that are prepared and ready and think about these things in advance will find it ultimately less economically painful when it comes to it. So, you know, for companies that might choose to be less prepared on some of these ESG issues, be that climate change or whatever else, that ultimately, given the clear direction of travel, I think Timo made a great point about earlier about the, you know, the clear direction of travel that we're getting from policymakers. You know, it behoves companies to act now and have plans and be prepared, or it will cost them more later when they experience the costs of having to deal with it in a sudden way. And I think that's what people are hopefully taking away as the lesson from this pandemic.
Thanks all. So we've just gone past the hour, and I'd like to thank all the audience members who've submitted questions. Unfortunately, we couldn't get to them all, but thank you for your attention today. And it also just leaves me to thank the panelists, which I think you'll all agree was a very insightful conversation. So I will hand back on to Harvey. Thank you.
Thank you, Ian. Yeah, we'd just like to thank all the panelists for taking time out of their day to be here and share their insightful thoughts. Also, a special thanks to Ian for hosting such an insightful discussion. If the viewers do want to revisit some of the points that were discussed during today's session, the recording of this will go up in a couple of days, and you should be able to find that on our on-demand service. So thank you everyone for being here, and enjoy the rest of your afternoon.